Imagine a boy with a head full of stories, the kind of stories that creep under the skin and whisper to you long after you've turned off the light. Now imagine that boy grows up and builds entire worlds out of those whispers. Worlds where gods walk among us, where dreams take shape, and where the boundary between myth and reality is as thin as a turning page. That boy's name was Neil Gaiman. Today, we're diving into the life of one of the most imaginative storytellers of our time, a man who redefined fantasy, reinvented comics, and somehow managed to make the strange feel completely human. This is Neil Gaiman, the man who dreamed in ink and shadow. Neil Richard Gaiman was born on November 10, 1960, in Portchester, England, to a family with deep religious and philosophical roots. His father worked in public relations for the Church of Scientology, a fact that would follow Neil into adulthood, while his mother was a pharmacist. But while the world around him was very much grounded in the real, young Neil's imagination was somewhere else entirely. He devoured books. The Chronicles of Narnia, Alice in Wonderland, and The Lord of the Rings became his companions, his portals to other worlds. He once said, "Fiction gives us empathy. It puts us inside the minds of other people, gives us the gift of seeing the world through someone else's eyes." That gift, the ability to inhabit other worlds and then rebuild them for the rest of us, would become the hallmark of his life. Gaiman's path wasn't straightforward. He didn't grow up thinking, "I'll be a famous author." In fact, after school, he worked as a journalist, writing articles and book reviews. It wasn't glamorous work, more like a front-row seat to other people's creativity. But it was an education. He learned structure, tone, and how stories worked under the hood. By the mid-1980s, he began experimenting with fiction of his own. That's when he stumbled upon an American import that would change everything. Comic books. And not the ones about capes and tights, the ones that dared to be literary. He discovered Alan Moore's Swamp Thing and realized that comics could be poetry, visual literature. Gaiman later said that when he read Swamp Thing, he thought, "I want to do that. I want to make people feel like this." So he did. In 1989, Gaiman created The Sandman, a comic book series published by DC Comics, but unlike anything the medium had ever seen before. Instead of a superhero, the main character was Dream, one of the seven endless, timeless beings who ruled over universal concepts like death, desire, and destiny. The story was dark, layered, and philosophical. It blended Shakespeare with horror, mythology with pop culture. Readers didn't just read The Sandman, they inhabited it. It became a cult phenomenon, the first comic ever to win a major literary award. Suddenly, Neil Gaiman wasn't just another writer, he was a literary rock star. Fans dressed as his characters at conventions. His words were quoted like scripture. But perhaps the most striking thing about The Sandman was its theme, that stories themselves have power, that dreams shape the waking world. It was a metaphor for Gaiman himself. After The Sandman ended in 1996, Gaiman could have easily faded into the shadows of comic book fame, but he didn't. Instead, he reinvented himself as a novelist. In 2001, he published American Gods, a sprawling modern myth that imagined old gods like Odin and Anansi wandering America, struggling for relevance in a land that now worshipped media and money. The novel was strange, poetic, and haunting. It won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards, cementing Gaiman's reputation not just as a comic writer, but as one of the most original voices in fantasy literature. And then came Coraline, a dark children's book, though really it was for everyone who still has a child's fears. When asked why he wrote such unsettling stories for young readers, Gaiman famously replied, "Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten." That one line captures the essence of his worldview. He doesn't write escapism, he writes survival. His stories give us courage to face the monsters, both real and imagined. What's fascinating about Neil Gaiman is how normal he seems in the middle of all this magic. In interviews, he's gentle, articulate, with a wry humor and that soft English voice that could turn a grocery list into a bedtime story. He's lived in both England and the US, often writing from a quiet home in Wisconsin. For years, he was married to musician Amanda Palmer, whose own theatrical world mirrored his eccentricity. Their relationship, passionate, public, chaotic, became almost a modern myth itself, a story of two artists orbiting one another through creativity and controversy. Through it all, Gaiman stayed remarkably prolific. He wrote The Graveyard Book, inspired by The Jungle Book, but set in a graveyard where ghosts raise an orphaned boy. It won the Newbery Medal and the Carnegie Medal, the first book ever to win both. He also worked on screen adaptations, from Stardust to Good Omens, bringing his surreal touch to millions of viewers. In a world dominated by sequels and franchises, Gaiman's work stood out for one reason. It was personal. Every story felt like it was whispered directly to you, one-on-one, in the dark. Of course, fame brings its shadows. In recent years, Gaiman has faced controversies, from publicized personal disputes to allegations that shook his long-standing reputation. Whether fair or not, they added complexity to his image. But perhaps that's fitting. Neil Gaiman's entire career has revolved around the idea that light and darkness coexist, that beauty is born from contradiction. In one of his essays, he wrote, "The world always seems brighter when you've just made something that wasn't there before." And that, in essence, is Gaiman. Not just a writer, but a maker of worlds, a man who spins the intangible, dreams, fears, myths, into something you can hold in your hands. Today, Neil Gaiman stands as a literary bridge between the old myths and the modern world, between the page and the screen, between the shadow and the light. He gave comics their soul back. He gave fantasy its poetry. And he reminded us that even in the darkest stories, hope lingers, quiet, patient, waiting for us to notice. Because, as he might say, stories don't really end. They just wait for someone to dream them again.